What if, in an alternate timeline, Portugal got all of Africa following the Congress of Berlin? Now before you click off, I know this is an unrealistic premise, but I will try to take a look at how this unrealistic premise may realistically turn out. As many of you will know, following the discovery of the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese divided the entire world between themselves. The Spanish got the Americas and the Portuguese got Africa and Asia. Of course, these claims were quickly ignored by the rest of the world and the Treaty of Tordesillas mostly became obsolete. But what if, during the Berlin Conference, where the European powers discussed what to do with the African continent, Portugal brought up this claim again? Obviously, realistically speaking, they would be laughed out of the room by the great powers. But what if, for whatever reason, all the delegates agreed to renounce their own claims in Africa to Portugal? We could try to think of some halfway realistic reason for this, for example, the great powers trying to assure African neutrality or something like that. But, if we are being honest, there isn't a realistic way for this to happen. So, I invite you to imagine your own version of how this happens. For my own headcanon, all of the delegates simply got drunk beyond their minds and decided it would be funny if they would give all of Africa to Portugal. Again, before everybody floods into the comments saying how unrealistic this is, yes, I know, this would never have happened and is absolutely ridiculous. But this is the starting point of the scenario. Let's try to figure out what realistically happened after this unrealistic start. Now, let us be clear, this is still just the Portugal we know from our own timeline we are talking about. Can, following the Congress of Berlin, Portugal just move in and establish control over the entire continent? Absolutely not. Portugal had about 5 million people around 1880. The entire continent of Africa had around 130 million. That's 26 Africans for every Portuguese person. Now you may well think, a similar ratio existed between Britain and India, and the Brits managed, but that's untrue. The British were only outnumbered by 6 to 1, a drastic difference. Not to mention the drastically different situation when comparing Africa to India, especially in terms of size and pre-existing governing structures. Now of course, the Portuguese have a significant technological advantage over much of Asia, but Portugal simply coming in and establishing control over the entire continent within a short time frame is ridiculous. So, let's begin by discussing Portugal's new possessions by discussing the European settlements along the coasts. Since, for whatever reason, the Europeans willingly gave up their claims on Africa, these settlements and outposts would, slowly but steadily, be abandoned. Some of them would be given to Portugal, some would simply be abandoned. The most unrealistic part of this scenario would come via French Algeria and South Africa. These weren't simply colonies as we usually think of them, but they had significant European populations and in the case of French Algeria was even considered a full-on part of France proper. Like mentioned before, this scenario is ridiculous and would never happen. But Britain and France would have to leave these territories. This would give way to a renewed Algerian independence, while the British settlers in Cape Colony would likely assert their own independence, and neither would seek to join Portugal. Then we need to discuss independent European actors. The colonization of Africa was not just driven by governmental actors, but much of the action was driven by independent adventurers, colonialists and capitalists. These would still operate, trying to gain concessions for their mother nations. But every time a significant territorial concession is granted, the mother nation would simply relinquish the concession, although economic concessions would still be sought out by many of the European nations, as economic concessions don't break the Conference of Berlin. This alternate struggle for Africa would cause immense discomfort across Europe, apart from in Portugal of course, as the nations keep giving up land and privileges in Africa for seemingly no good reason. Within all European nations, and especially their governments, especially from the bigger nations of Germany, Britain and France, there would be significant unrest about the decisions made in the Berlin Conference. But, for the sake of this scenario, despite this unrest, the European nations remained true to their promises to Portugal. Meanwhile, the Portuguese would start trying to assert their authority further over the continent. But it would be very slow. Territories with large settled kingdoms or nations would be mostly ignored, as Portugal scarcely has the means to find many of these large organized nations. Nations like Egypt, Algeria, the South African states, Sokoto, Ethiopia and Morocco would, for the foreseeable future, be safe from any Portuguese influence. When over the course of the next couple of decades, the Portuguese would expand their control, they run into a huge issue. Their manpower is so little to control this huge territory. From the barely 5 million people the Portuguese have, They have to recruit armies to gain and retain control, they need to recruit governors to govern the new territories, and they need bureaucrats to actually ensure the decisions made by higher-ups can be followed. While 5 million may sound like a lot of people, not every Portuguese person can simply be pressed into governing roles in Africa. Many of these 5 millions are women, children, or simply poorly educated. Meanwhile, much of the Portuguese population is still needed to work normal jobs to keep Portugal itself functioning, like farming, shopkeeping, trading, etc. The sheer logistical operation of continually finding more and more Portuguese to staff the new territories is enormous. And while certain territories would bring the Portuguese newfound wealth, mainly territories with much gold or diamond wealth, much of the land barely brings more monetary benefit than it costs. It's mostly just a vanity project for the Portuguese. The Portuguese would focus on Central Africa and mostly ignore South Africa. Despite the diamond wealth of the Boers, it would be way too costly of an operation for the Portuguese. The British had difficulty fighting the Boer Wars, and they were, arguably, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen at that point. The same goes, as mentioned before, for the more centralized nations. This is one of the most significant differences of this alternate timeline. In 1880, Portugal has a significant advantage over the Africans technologically. But the longer Portugal stalls in taking over the larger nations, the more these African nations can catch up. And once the Africans have caught up to the Portuguese, there is no hope for the Portuguese to launch conquests of these states. As the decades pass, the other European nations will still desire African resources, and Portugal is too weak and too slow to fully supply all demands. While Portugal, or at least their elites, would become immensely wealthy by selling off African resources, they would have to share the spotlight with native African empires. It is quite possible that by around 1905, a couple of decades after the Berlin Conference, a new, lower intensity scramble for Africa begins. But now between Portugal and native African empires. Don't expect something crazy like Morocco suddenly reaching all the way down to Guinea, but do expect a rise of the centralized African states, especially the larger resource-rich ones, as they sell their resources in exchange for European weaponry. Now, let's take a look back at Europe. Europe would certainly be changed, although not as much as you might expect. The Suez Canal would still exist, and would probably still be owned by French and British companies. The French and Brits would, since they can't take the nation over, prop up the Egyptian government to keep the Suez open and stable, and so goods would still be able to flow between Asia and Europe. African resources, through Portugal, native empires or European companies, would still manage to flow to Europe as needed. But the biggest change for the Europeans would be diplomatically. While, for whatever reason, the governments in 1884 decided that Portugal could have an entire continent, after a generation, there would be many voices that started to call for ignoring the Berlin Conference. The loudest of these would come from Germany, who under Wilhelm II sought to establish Germany as a great colonial empire as well. While he had managed to grab some Pacific territories, these were inconsequential in the grand scale, and they really couldn't compare to the colonies that Britain or even France had in the region. But the diplomatic balance of power would ensure the continuity of the Conference of Berlin. If one nation, on their own, ignores the Berlin Conference, they would become diplomatically isolated, as no one wants to grant their opponents an inch of African territory. While Britain and France would heavily regret their dumb decision to grant Portugal all of Africa, they do still have empire elsewhere, and also much more overseas economic clout. For Britain and France, having Portugal and native empires rule the continent gives them much more indirect influence, as Portugal is weak enough to be influenced by these great powers. French and British companies would still operate and dominate much of the African landscape. So, for the French and British, there wasn't much reason to break the Berlin Conference. Sure, if they broke the conference, they could grab some more territory directly, sure, but this would require granting concessions to nations like Germany or Italy, or even the potential of a European war breaking out. While the Conference of Berlin is unpopular across the board, it would survive out of sheer necessity, because great power competition within Europe wouldn't allow a single nation to start breaking it, and the diplomatic climate of cooperation that allowed the Conference of Berlin in 1884 did not exist anymore, preventing a second conference to be launched to discuss a new division of the continent. Economically, Portugal would be way richer, and on the whole, the major European nations would be slightly weaker economically, but not by much. Apart from some select colonies like South Africa with their diamonds, or the Congo with their heavy exploitation, many of the colonies didn't necessarily benefit the Europeans directly in a major way, economically speaking. And despite not owning the land themselves, European companies and traders could still independently try to gain the rights to resources or trading. Even without direct colonization, there would still be economic exploitation of the African continent. And it may be even more beneficial for the European economies, since they don't have to worry about governing, educating and the like. But all they need to do is to provide the infrastructure for economic activity. Now, there is still one more colonial nation apart from Portugal in this alternate timeline. The Ottomans, nominally, still held control over Egypt and Libya. In our own timeline, Britain consolidated the real control over Egypt, but they allowed the Ottomans to pretend like Egypt was still part of their empire. Because of the more complicated geopolitical situation considering Africa, and the desire to keep the Suez Canal safe, the British and the French would likely ensure full independence for Egypt to be able to indirectly defend their trading routes without having to rely on the Ottomans. By around 1910, we have Africa looking something like this, and we finally have the event that will break the Conference of Berlin. The core diplomatic climate in Europe is not that drastically changed, although the focus will have been elsewhere. But the French still desire Alsace, Germany is still scared of Russia, Russia is still mad at the Austrians, the Italians still want to expand, and Germany is still building a fleet to challenge Britain and the Conference of Berlin by building an empire. The details will have been different. Perhaps the war starts in a different year, for a different reason, but for the sake of simplicity, we shall assume that it breaks out somewhere around 1910, although this may have very well not been the case. One thing that may have been very different than in our own timeline's 1914 is the Balkans. As I explored in this video, Italy doesn't get the green light to invade Ottoman Libya, which could quite possibly have caused the Balkan nations to not attack the Ottomans before World War I breaks out, meaning that the Balkans look drastically different in this alternate timeline. As the World War breaks out, the Conference of Berlin would soon become a relic of the past. Not immediately, but over the duration of the war. Britain and France would have to ensure their now weaker control over the Suez Canal, probably dragging Egypt into the Entente, whether they like it or not. This would be an insult to the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans wouldn't directly join the conflict yet. But it's very well possible that somewhere down the line, the Balkan stage, egged on by the Russians and potentially Britain, declare war on the Ottomans as well to start a new front against the Central Powers in the Balkans. Now the war itself would be significantly changed, especially for the French. Where Britain still has a huge empire to pull forces from, apart from their own mainland, the French Empire is puny when compared to our own timeline. During World War I, 10% of the French army came from their colonies. The lack of colonial forces, while by no means a death blow to the French army, would be felt over time. So at this point, how does the war progress? Well, one of the most significant nations to convince to join your side would obviously be Portugal. On this front, the Entente had a huge advantage over the Germans. The Portuguese biggest trading partner would undoubtedly be Britain. The Germans would be using U-boats on Portuguese vessels going to Britain. At the same time, the Germans have not so secretly been complaining about the Berlin Conference, talking about how they would really like some colonies in Africa, and not to mention the fact that economically the Entente was way more important to the Portuguese. So, a couple of years into the war perhaps, Portugal would side with the Entente, although it mostly just participates in the naval war. From here, I could go on to detail the entire war, but the general trends are more important and are quite similar to our own timeline. The Germans perform well at the start, but they do get bogged down in the west. They have more success against the Russians, and at some point the Russians collapse. Whether the Bolsheviks or another form of government takes over the nation when Russia's government falls is impossible to say, as we have completely changed the timing of everything. The Balkan theater is a back and forth until it likely gets bogged down in the mountains for most of the war. Eventually the Germans, mainly because of the British blockade, couldn't hold on any longer and the Central Powers would start to unravel. And at this alternate Treaty of Versailles, the Conference of Berlin would finally be broken, as one thing that needs to be decided upon is the division of the Ottoman Empire. The French and British, as mentioned before, regretted their own idiotic decision of granting the Portuguese all of Africa. As the issue of who gets to own Libya is discussed, Portugal is the first nation that comes up, as, following the Congress of Berlin, they have the only claim on the region. But France and Britain aren't about to make the same mistake again. The treaties of Paris would officially acknowledge the boundaries of Portuguese control over Africa, perhaps even expanding it a little bit to satisfy them, but the territories that aren't yet owned by clear and defined states would finally be divided between Italy, Britain and France. So let's conclude the scenario, as where the world goes from here on is incredibly difficult to say. Africa starts to fill up a bit more, but when compared to our own timeline, it is completely unrecognizable. Much of Africa is still ruled by native empires, only indirectly influenced or dominated by the Europeans. But the single biggest difference, obviously, is the huge Portuguese Empire in the middle of the continent. From here we can go two ways. The first is that there is a renewed interest in colonizing all of Africa. I consider this the less likely option, but it is possible. Britain, France and Italy start carving up the less centralized land, and during the interwar period they continue taking nations like Morocco, Algeria, Ethiopia and Sokoto. Especially if Mussolini rises in Italy, it is not too far-fetched to think that some of these nations may fall. But after the horrors of the First World War, I think it would be unlikely for the Europeans to commit to mass new invasions of Africa. The second option is that this is it. Much like nations like Thailand, Japan, China and Ethiopia in our own timeline, these African states just continue to be independent, doing their own stuff during the interwar periods and afterwards. Some of these states may align with the alternate axis if a Second World War happens, while others remain on the sideline or join the Allies. But one thing that's certain is that the Portuguese colony is way too big to keep control over. Once nationalism starts to rise across the African continent, especially as there are many native empires still left over, and the Portuguese colonies start to become unruly, the Portuguese simply don't have the manpower or resources to keep control over about a third of a continent. But this is where I'll end the scenario, as there is little to say about its continuation at this point. Obviously, the consequences of this scenario are immense, especially because so much of world and especially African history has now been butterflied. I can't say much with certainty. But it is very likely that following full decolonization, Africa starts to perform much healthier than in our own timeline, especially the territories which have never been carved up by the Europeans. Especially as the colony of Portugal starts to break up, it's very likely that this happens in a much more natural way instead of the borders being defined by pre-existing boundaries between colonial powers. But let us know in the comments where you think the scenario goes from here. As always, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do consider leaving a like and a comment, as it helps me out massively against the algorithm. Most of you aren't subscribed either, so do consider subscribing for a new alternate history video every single Sunday. And if you want to support the content more directly and allow me to dedicate more and more of my time to just making YouTube videos, then do consider going to Patreon to support me there. You will get early access to all of my videos whenever possible, the moment I finish them myself. And as an added bonus, you get added to this awesome animation. As always, thank you all for watching and goodbye.